And I'm going to read to you guys from the book of Mark, chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Where it says, "He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes to his Father's glory with the holy angels." There was a man by the name of Fred, and he inherited a large, huge land grant. But the will provided that he could choose the land that he wanted in either Chile or Brazil. So he chose Brazil. Well, unhappily, if he had chosen Chile, he would have received his inheritance in land on which they had just recently discovered uranium and gold and silver. But he chose Brazil. When he arrived in Brazil, he had to choose between receiving his inheritance in a coffee plantation or land with Brazil nut trees on it. And he chose the nut trees. And immediately the bottom fell out of the nut market. But the coffee futures went up $2 a pound. The government took control of the nut farm for back taxes, and Fred was left destitute. Fred pawned his Rolex watch for the money that he needed to fly either to New York or Boston. He chose Boston. When the plane for New York taxied up, he noticed it was a brand new Super Concorde with red carpets. And after several hours' delay, the plane for Boston arrived, and it was a 1928 twin-engine plane held together with baling wire, and it was filled with cigar smokers and unattended crying babies. Over the mountains, one of the engines fell off, and Fred, frightened by his earlier bad choices and fearing for his life, asked for 2 parachutes. And he jumped, and as he fell through the air, he tried to make up his mind which ripcord to pull. And he pulled the cord on the left, but nothing happened. So he pulled the cord on his right, but it broke. In desperation, the poor fellow cried out, "St. Francis, save me!" And a great hand from heaven reached down and seized him by the wrist and left him dangling in midair. And then a gentle but inquisitive voice said, or asked, "St. Francis Xavier or St. Francis of Assisi?" This poor guy couldn't win for losing. But that's life sometimes. Life is risky because it's full of choices where we don't always know the outcome. And it's the same with choosing to follow Christ. There is a great risk involved because we don't always know how people are going to respond to that choice. Some may appreciate the choice because of the changes that it brings into our lives, but others may very well reject us for choosing to follow Jesus because they resent those very changes. They resent the person that it makes us become. You see, history is filled with examples of women and men who, by throwing away their lives, gained life eternal. Late in the 4th century, there was a certain monk who had made up his mind to leave the world and live all alone in prayer and meditation and fasting so that he could save his soul. That was his only goal. But in doing this, he felt like there was something wrong or something missing in his life. And one day he rose from his knees in prayer, and it suddenly dawned on him that his life was based on a selfish, not selfless love for God. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever wondered if your faith is here to serve your needs and interests only, or to serve the greater good of all people? Anyhow, this monk came to the conclusion that if he was going to really serve God, that he was going to have to serve others. So he said goodbye to the desert, and he headed for the greatest city in the world, Rome. And there was still an arena in Rome at that time, and there was still gladiator games. Christians were no longer being thrown to the lions, but instead they had to fight and kill one another. And the crowds loved it. It was like NASCAR or March Madness in college basketball for them. And this monk found his way to the arena, and there were 80,000 people there. And the chariot races were just ending, and there was an excitement in the crowd as the Christians prepared to fight and kill one another. And the fight was on, and the monk was appalled. And people for which Christ had died were killing each other to amuse the crowd. So this monk leapt over the barrier and got between the two fighters. And for a moment, they stopped fighting. "Let the games go on," the crowd roared. So they pushed the monk aside, and again, he got between the two fighters. And the crowd hurled some stones at the monk, and they urged the fighters to kill him and get him out of the way. And then the commander of the games gave the order, and the gladiator's sword rose, and it flashed, and the monk lay dead. Immediately, the crowd went silent. They were suddenly shocked that a holy man should be killed in such a way. We might say that the crowd all of a sudden became convicted. Suddenly there was a mass realization of what this killing really was. The games ended abruptly that day, and those games never began again. That was the end of it. The monk, by dying, had ended them. One author writes, his death was more useful to humankind than his life was. By losing his life, he had done more than he could have ever done by living it out in lonely devotion to the Lord in the desert. God gave all of us life to spend, not to keep. If we live always thinking of our own gain, of our own ease, of our own comfort, and of our own security, if our single aim is to make life as long and as trouble-free as possible, if we make no effort except for ourselves, we are losing life all the time, and not in a good way. But if we live our lives for others, if we forget wealth and comfort in order to do something great for Jesus and for others, we are winning life all the time. In our gospel lesson this morning, Jesus makes his first prediction for his upcoming trial and his death. And when Peter hears this, he thinks Jesus is insane and he needs to have an exorcism. We're told that Peter took Christ aside and he began to rebuke him. The verb for rebuke is the same word used to silence demons. Only a few verses back in this chapter, Peter confessed that Jesus was the Christ. Apparently, Peter had a different definition of the Messiah from Jesus' own definition. Peter wanted Jesus to be a sort of a Jewish Caesar, maybe, if you will. This kind of Messiah would call his disciples to position and power and privilege and prestige. Yet Jesus is talking about suffering and dying. And because of this, Peter tries to set Jesus straight, but Jesus will have none of it. Jesus comes back at Peter with the same intensity that Peter had aimed at Jesus. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man." Confronted with the necessity of suffering, most of us would react exactly like Peter. In a painkiller culture, it's hard for us to understand suffering, even for the right reasons. But Jesus gives us the challenge to think like God thinks, not as we human beings normally think. Now, don't get me wrong. Jesus' healing miracles and Jesus' compassion for the crowds at the feeding miracles make it clear that God does not delight in human suffering. The disciples were sent out to heal as well as to preach the gospel. But the danger lies in thinking that suffering and self-sacrifice are always to be avoided. See, we Christians often think that if we just pray enough, God will remove all the trials from our life. A family with maybe a drug-addicted teenager might be pressured to pray harder and the kid will just come around, rather than for the strength to care for their child and find the right treatment and support. Maybe if we just thought about it for a minute, maybe that prayer being answered was finding the right treatment center for their child. Prayer is very important in healing, but prayer is an opening up of ourselves to what God's will is. Not an exercise in forcing God to do our will. And that is what discipleship or following Christ is about as well. A disciple must take up the cross. They must be willing to lose his or her life and must not deny when confronted by coworkers or family or friends. The picture of the condemned criminal carrying the cross to the place of execution should form within us a shocking requirement for discipleship. See, our human standards can't come close to explaining the necessity of this kind of commitment to the will of God. Commitment to Jesus brings persecution because this world is very contrary to God. We can't expect the gospel of Jesus Christ to match our own desires and the demands of the world. See, the gospel was not formulated to the convenience and comfort of those of us who preach it to others, because we Christians are called to deny self. We don't have to invent some fancy form of persecution, complex in order to live this kind of life. The gospel itself calls us to deny self in order to be more like Christ. Being a Christian, being a follower of Christ, it's not a prestigious job. Our physical lives are rarely in danger, but our own desires and whims, they definitely are. Fred Craddock points this out in this way. He says, we think giving our all to the Lord is like taking $1,000 out and laying it down on the table, saying, here's a $1,000 bill, Lord. Here's my life. I'm giving it all. And the reality for most of us is that God takes that $1,000 and hands it back and says, I want you to take this to the bank and cash it in for $1,000 worth of quarters. And we go through life putting our 25 cents here and 50 cents there. Giving our life to Christ isn't glamorous. It's done in all those little acts of love, 25 cents at a time. God gave us life to spend, not to keep. A rock song by the band Def Leppard screamed out, it's better to burn out than to fade away. What could have happened to life if everyone had just wished for nothing but to comfortably stay at home and there had been no such thing as an explorer or a pioneer? What would life be like? I don't think it'd be very exciting. What would happen if every mother refused to ever even risk bearing a child because of what could happen? What would happen if everyone spent all they had on themselves? The very essence of the Christian life found in risking life and spending life, not in saving it and hoarding it. Jesus says, whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his own soul? It is better to burn out than to rust out. Christ's followers are called to literally say no to self. We must say no to self and yes to Christ. We must say no to self-seeking and self-will. We must be able to say with Paul, it's no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And I wonder, can we say that? As Christ's followers, we no longer follow our own will, but the will of Christ. And in doing this, we find perfect freedom. You know, Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it. And I think of the rich ruler who said, you know, what do I have to do? And he says, follow the Ten Commandments. He says, I'm already doing all that. Man, I got it all down. All 10 of them. But what do I really got to do? And he says, give everything you own away and follow me. And he says, oh, I can't do that. I like my nice car, and I really like my house. You know, and my 60-inch TV is LED, and it's smart, and it's 3D, and it's HD, and it's like the latest thing. And, you know, I've only had it like a month. I'm not ready to give that up yet. And he couldn't do it. If each day we could go out of our house with only one of these sentences locked in our hearts and dominating our lives, it would be far more than enough to be a Christ follower. Jesus never tried to lure anyone to him by the offer of an easy way. He sought to challenge us, to waken the boldness and the moral courage in our souls by the offer of a way that could not be any higher or any harder. Jesus came not to make life easy, but to challenge us to greatness. Are you ready to be great? It's not going to seem great because there's a lot of grunt work to be done. But I've told you 100 times before, the benefits are out of this world. And I think if God challenges you to greatness, if Jesus challenges you to greatness, what a way to live. It is the way to live. It's the only way I want to live. And I pray it's the way you want to live too.